have some time for Q&A. Dr. Georg Northoff holds the Michael Smith Chair in Neurosciences and Mental Health, and also a Canada Research Chair for Mind, Brain Imaging, and Neuroethics at the University of Ottawa, the Institute of Mental Health Research. He completed his training in medicine, psychiatry, and philosophy in Germany, and has held professorships at Magdeburg and Harvard universities. With over 100 publications, his current focus on self, having developed the concept of cortical midline structures, has been developed now with experimental research within his unit that focuses on the functional and biochemical mechanisms underlying our sense of self, both in healthy subjects and in psychiatric patients. In addition to neuroimaging, he also focuses on neuroethical issues. Finally, these issues converge with the disciplines of neurophilosophy. Will you welcome this evening Dr. Georg Northoff?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting and introducing. You can already see the central question of my talk. So I try to approach the question of religious experience from a neuroscientific and philosophical perspective. And of course you might question from the process perspective, from the Whiteheadian perspective, and as well as from the religious perspective, what can the brain and neuroscience contribute? Well, now this doesn't work. This is strange. Let me just try. Nothing works anymore. Okay, there it is. It had its reason why it was delayed. Okay, so the question is really, what can we learn? Oh, yeah, now it works better. Okay, so what can we learn from the brain? Of course, I know it's very hip. Everybody comes up with this grey matter stuff, and I quoted here sort of indirectly Arthur Schopenhauer, who spoke about the grey powdery mass, and I added the gruesome to it. So the question is really, what can we learn what can we get for Whitehead and process studies out of the encounter with neuroscience? And in turn, that also begs the question, can we get something out for neuroscience from the encounter with Whitehead? And as you will see in my talk, it's sort of a bilateral pathway. So let me just very briefly sketch in one slide sort of what I aim to put across. The first is the general aim. I really tried sort of a preliminary linkage between Whitehead's philosophy and neuronal mechanisms. And I intentionally say preliminary because I'm a completely new scholar in the field of process study. It was long on my list to read Whitehead, so finally this was a trigger to really take the time and do it. And Whitehead himself probably would have spoken of working hypotheses, which are sort of preliminary and need to be constantly validated and investigated again and again and matched with reality, with the facts. And you will see that his idea of the relationship between science and philosophy is very guiding for me, and I will come back to that towards the end of it. So you see already the methodology. I briefly indicated that I take particular concepts from Whitehead. So I stick to the concepts and say and try to search for corresponding neuronal mechanisms. And I intentionally say here corresponding, and you see already the one of you who is versatile in philosophical issues, it's a non-reductive approach. So this is very important for me. It's not that I say, okay, I can replace the concept by the neuronal mechanism, but it's rather, as I say here, a mutual specification. So concepts are always vague. They have always sort of some empty position in themselves. And this vagueness may be somehow partially specified by the encounter with the empirical world and by the experimental investigation of the facts. And on the other hand, the data we yield, they acquire some meaning if you link them with certain concepts. So if you want to say, so sort of if you want to put a famous quote by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant into a different context, I would say that concepts without facts remain empty, and facts or data without concepts remain blind. And part of that is the other thing which I indicate here. You may know that not even far from here, one of the main proponents, Crick and Koch, for the neural correlates approach of consciousness, and that basically means they look for the sufficient neuronal conditions of consciousness. I take a different stance here, and I say I don't look for the sufficient conditions, I just look for the necessary conditions, the enabling condition, the necessary condition of the possibility of phenomenal states. So that implies a non-reductive approach, or at least it opens. So whereas if you have a sufficient neural correlate approach, it implicitly implies, makes necessary a reductive approach. So this is a very important thing, because on that it depends whether you consider the brain as an isolated neuronal organ, that's a correlate approach, or whether you want to keep open the possibility that you consider the brain in the context of the environment. So that the brain is intrinsically social, and you will see I come back to that. So, as I always like to say, if you make small changes or modifications at the beginning, it will have major implications at the end. So this is what I'm looking here is for neuronal predisposition, necessary conditions of the possibility of. Then I start choose certain concepts from Whitehead, and as I said, please back my excuse, I'm far away from being an expert. It's a new encounter for me. It's a very interesting encounter, and I see a lot of linkages. So please, if I have some conceptual or unsharp definitions or wrong definitions, please put it up in discussion. So the first is sort of what I want to take on, the concept of prehension and conformation. The second one is the emotion as subjective form. The third one is perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And the fourth is sort of his methodology, is a bilateral linkage between science and philosophy. And there you see I will link that to a project Tandeka and I plan together. And I will now in the following discuss each of these concepts in relation to specific neuronal mechanisms. And my empirical starting point is the sense of self and its neuronal processes. And when I speak here of self, just let me take, I don't want to go into the detailed definition of self because there's a long debate and diversion about it. What I'm, just as a working definition, I mean by self, a sense of self, a subjective experience of a sense of self. So when I mean it's a very basically when I talk about self, I mean a basic sense of subjectivity. That if you would stand here, you would have physically exactly the same perspective as I would have, but you would perceive in a different way. So that's basically what I mean by very basic sense of subjectivity or self. Yeah. So this is very important. You might want to associate it with the first-person perspective, but I would consider it even prior to that. Sort of at the very bottom of the net as a condition of the possibility of differentiating between first and third-person perspective. So, first specific aim, Whitehead's concept of prehension and the brain's self-related processing. So I'll start with some empirical findings, and then I come back to the concept of prehension. So the self is very popular, not only for the neuroscientific researchers themselves, because without their own self, they couldn't research the self, but it's also in the neuroscience. So it has been really since 10, 15 years, and basically what the people did is sort of you saw some certain trait adjectives, and then you had to decide whether that adjectives fits to your own person or not. So this is a very sort of cognitive definition of the self, which is presupposed there. And interestingly, these studies, so we did a meta-analysis on this, and interestingly, these studies showed a lot of activity right in the midline of the brain. So basically, if you want to slice your brain, I'm not sure whether you really want to do that, just in the middle, this is basically what you see. And you see, these are all the activation from the different studies on the self, and it's really located in the medial regions of the brain, or as we coined the cortical midline structure. And it's important, it's independent from the stimuli, whether it's a motor stimuli or facial stimuli or memory stimuli or social stimuli, they're all, the degree of self-relatedness recruited the activity in these regions. So it was not the physical features of the stimuli, but it was the degree of relatedness to the own self which recruits this, the activity in this region. And this distinction is very important because it has major conceptual implications later. And this is just, I don't want to go into detail, this is sort of a detailed anatomy of these cortical midline structures, some of the abbreviations, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, for instance, or peridian anterocingulate cortex. So I don't want to go into detail. If somebody wants more details, then I'm happy to provide it in the discussion. So the question is, okay, we somehow have, okay, these cortical midline structures seem to be central in what we call self. But now what exactly is the self? It is not that you can find the self one-to-one in your brain. So there's certain processes going on which yield and generate as their result what we as outside observers call self. And of course I'm interested in these processes which the brain itself yields and with the result of what we call self. So one of the ideas is that, you know, when you have a sense of self, or when you see yourself, or when you get something like, if you like hot chocolate, you get your chocolate, it has a high degree of personal relevance, and it has also a high degree of value for you. It has a reward. So something which is very close to you, you feel good, it makes you, you have a feel reward, you have a positive emotions. I come in the next step to the emotions. And it has a reward, it has a value for you. So one of the ideas we had here is sort of, why then not comparing a paradigm about the self with a paradigm about reward? And then look what happens in the reward regions where value is generated during self. And this is exactly what we did. So when you're in the scanner, this fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, you have to perform a certain task, and then you see what kind of neural activity changes you get during that task. So, as I said, I don't want to go into detail here. For the reward, people had to gamble. This is typical for money. They had to bet right or left mouse click, and then here they won in this instance, and at the end of the paradigm task they got some money. Here they had to do exactly the same, but this time it wasn't about betting for money, but it was about sort of whether this, for instance, this stimulus had a high degree of personal relevance or not. For instance, when you're hungry, I'm sure this cake has a high degree of personal relevance. If you're not hungry, if you just had a whole cake by yourself, then I'm sure it has not such a high degree of relevance. So you see it's already very context sensitive. So, and this allowed us to see first, to delineate the reward system, which is classics, this is nothing special, and then see what happens in the reward system during self. And that in turn, we wanted to use that information to see how the relationship between the two is. So this is what we did. For the experts on you in the brain, this is a typical region. This is the nucleus accumbens / ventral striatum, subcortical region, typical region implicated in reward. And you see a nice difference between win and lose. This is no surprise, has all been shown. But what is really interesting that in exactly the same region and already subcortically, you see also a nice differentiation between high self and low self. So you see a clear difference already in subcortical region between what is personally relevant and what is not personally relevant. And that is a surprise, because in subcortical regions you usually do not assign consciousness. So that means that the degree of personal relevance is already processed subcortically beneath the realm of consciousness. Well, that's an interesting thing, because usually consciousness you associate with cortical regions, a little bit higher up. So, and it goes even deeper down subcortically. This is the ventral tegmental area, typical reward region, deep down, in your brainstem here, in your midbrain. You see windows, and you also see a nice differentiation between high self, low self. So, and then you see another region, it's like this, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex region is here. So, let me just skip this slide, I think that's, so we did the same then also, just to show how that can change also in psychiatric subjects. So, and we did this in alcoholic patients. So we also included some alcoholic stimuli. And of course, as no surprise, the alcoholic patients rated the alcohol stimuli much more with high self than the healthy subjects. And clinically, these patients often show a complete lack of personal interest in personally relevant activities. I remember that I had a very famous grand pianist as a patient, and he was really well known, and he loved to play piano, it was his life. And then his wife divorced, and since then he became completely alcoholic and only drank and had no interest at all in playing the piano. So how is that possible that you get a complete loss of personally relevant activity? So what you can see here we did the same experiment. You see again in healthy the differentiation, and here it's completely flat. There's no difference between high self and low self. So this guy sees the grand piano, and it doesn't induce activity in him anymore. It has no, so, and of course he tries to stimulate his reward system here, and to get some self-relevance, what he probably tries then to do by alcohol, to get some activity going, but you see, he desperately fails. And if you don't have any activity during personal relevance, and then you don't experience any sense of self, no experience of value, of course, then you don't play the piano, then you have no interest, then you withdraw. Yeah. So that's exactly what happens. So you see the other region, again, this region, the ventral tegmental area, more or less the same pattern. So what does this tell us about self-relatedness? So you see, self seems to be closely related to value and reward. Value means that a stimulus, a purely physical feature stimulus, is assigned a certain value. And ultimately that comes down to a meaning and a personal relevance. And then of course you might think, what is the underlying process which accounts for that? So we assume what we call self-related processes. It's that the self relates to external stimuli from the environment as well as internal stimuli from the body, and assigns a degree of certain value as well as self-relatedness or personal relevance. So that means, in conceptual terms, that we consider the self as a genuine relational concept of self, because it consists in this relation, and this relation might be exhibited to different degrees, stronger and lesser degree of self-relatedness. So ultimately, if you ask me what is the self in conceptual terms, it may be a form or a mode of neuronal organization, self-related processing, or if you want to say so, that every stimulus which is incoming into the brain is coded in relation to the self. Yeah, so we speak of relational coding. So that pertains to the history of philosophy, rejection of metaphysical entities, as for instance Descartes, self as mental substance, that persists as the self is everywhere present. I will show the studies that the self is also closely linked to emotions, and this is exactly what we experience in real life. Our self is always there, but we can never grasp it. And exactly that apparently seems to happen the same in the brain. It is interacting with all the kinds of different functions we in neuroscience investigate: reward, emotion, sensory perception, etc., and working memory. It is as finger, the self is everywhere. So that means that we also have to not reject but complement the higher order cognitive determination of the self, which is often presupposed in philosophy, self as self-consciousness. So it's a very reflective concept of self. But the findings, and I did not show here, most of the findings, but already the subcortical location indicates that maybe we have to assume a more basic form of self. The phenomenologists speak of a pre-reflective self, precognitive self, but I think we have to go even one step further down, a very much more basic sense of self. And then when you come to the concept of self as form or mode of neuronal organization. And I know what I'm doing here, but I may not know in detail, but I'm sure we can discuss this later. So maybe the self is, what we call self, is a continuous process of the relating of the self to stimuli outside itself, to stimuli from the body and the environment. So that, of course, leads the question, how is the brain's self-related processing, defined in this way, related to what Whitehall called prehension? As I said, please forgive me, I'm not an expert in that. One central aspect, as I understand the concept of prehension, is really the flow of time. That the past moment is integrated into the present moment, and that the present moment has to conform to the past moment. And the same for the future and the present, that the present provides a predisposition, sort of circumscribes the space of possibilities for what could possibly happen in the future or what could not possibly happen. And that pertains to the question, if you want to link it to what I call self-related processing, I would need to investigate experimentally self-related processing in respect to time. So meaning that maybe the self-related processing relates stimuli also across time, like within 500 milliseconds, for instance, or 600 milliseconds. And I do think that that also relates to the concept of phenomenal time as established by Husserl, the retention, presence, and potential. And this is, of course, something we plan to investigate, that really that the self-related processing is temporalized. It happens across different, distinct physical time, moments in time. And how then the past also predicts, at least partially, the present, and how the present conforms partially to the past. And of course, as a psychiatrist, for me it's even more important how much maybe the present may dissociate from the past, because this is what you see, for instance, in schizophrenia. There you see a loosening of the relation in time, of the temporal grid, of the temporal matrix, which is somehow disrupted. In depression, it's completely pulled back to the past. They cannot reach out to the present anymore. So this transition from past to present, it remains impossible. So they remain stuck in the past, and of course then you become hopeless and suicidal. Yeah. So this is currently a study we're actually doing in Hangzhou in China, where we investigate the ability to temporal extension, temporal stretching in healthy subjects and suicidal subjects. The other question is, if I'm talking about this mechanism, how past time enters present time, how present time conforms to the past, and the same for the relationship between present and future. The question is, that's now an empirical experimental question, how is this integration, this conformation realized? So what kind of mechanism, biological, there must be a neuronal mechanism. Most likely it addresses the question of coding. So how is the past moment coded so that it can relate to the present moment? So this is what I described here, the commonly underlying mechanism for the different temporal moments in relation to self-related processing. And I would argue that this linkage between different time moments may be the very basis, may not be identical, but the very basis of the possibility of self-related processing. It establishes a certain temporal grid, temporal continuity, upon which then the stimuli from the environment can be related. So So you're asking, what is the underlying integrator, if you want to speak so? I know this is a very mechanistic, and we had this argument before, but let me just sort of take it as a figurative metaphor. Yeah. So what mechanism in the brain makes this integration possible? It must be a very basic mechanism, because timing every second. You experience a continuity of time. I don't need to tell you, you have all read Whitehead much more than I do, the temporal continuity and also spatial continuity. Yeah? So there's always a flow of time, as William James said, and this flow is not given. It's a construction. Because it's not given, you can see that this flow of time is disrupted in psychiatric disorder, like schizophrenia, depression. So one of the hypotheses we are currently pursuing is that the brain has an intrinsic activity. We in neuroscience is often called resting state activity. It's an intrinsic activity. And this intrinsic activity might have some of the features we don't know yet. This is completely novel territory, which might predispose for such temporal integration. So the question is, if that hypothesis is plausible, you would expect a strong overlap between self and resting state. Because self-related processing is supposed to be based on temporal continuity, and temporal continuity is associated with resting state, hence it's easy to make that inference. So this is exactly what we did, and we did some meta-analysis, and I show you also later a study which shows a strong overlap between the high regions with high resting state activity and the regions which are recruited during self-related processing. And these regions predominantly here, as we call them, the anterior cortical midline regions. So just when you basically do like this, then you get these regions I'm talking about. So there's a strong overlap between self and rest. So this is very interesting, and also in this posterior region. So in these regions you have high resting state activity, and in these regions you also have a high activity during self-related processing, during personally relevant stimuli. So that means that the self-related processing may be somehow predisposed by some kind of feature yet unknown in the resting state activity itself. So I don't want to go through this. This is, I know this is a very busy slide. I shouldn't have shown this. So this leads to the question. The question is, so if there is, so you have to see me now. So your resting state activity is sort of in an optimal mode, and you might be able sort of to relate the stimuli you receive from me to your resting state activity, and they may be very well integrated into your resting state activity. Then you attribute, as I hope of course, a high degree of personal relevance to me. But if your resting state activity is in a very bad state, I can be as personally relevant to you as you want, your brain may not be able to properly integrate it, because the predispositions excuse me, from the side of the resting states are not given, are not optimal. So no matter what I talk, even it's good, you're simply not ready for it. So that means that what we call the sense of self may be a result of a specific interaction between the resting state and the stimulus. And in this case, both have a say in that. This is why this is currently what we investigate, and it also may yield some of the properties of the resting state which may let the brain react in certain ways to the stimuli. So just a very short historical feedback. Often the brain, particularly in Sharing, a famous neurologist beginning of the last century, and also very much still in recent cognitive neuroscience, this is basically the scenario you get. You see a painting. Before I moved to Canada, this was for some months in my basement. I remember this was forgotten in the Museum of Oslo, not stolen. Yeah. So basically the stimulus induces some activity in the brain called stimulus-induced activity, and this activity is completely and exclusively determined by the stimulus itself. So meaning the brain itself has no say in what happens in it. So the brain is just considered a passive recipient. But the scenario I sketched and the findings in recent neuroscience go in this direction, others in our own, and you see that the brain is an active player. The brain wants to say a lot, and it tells you a lot. And trust me, as a psychiatrist, I know how much the brain can tell you. So you have an intrinsic activity, and with this intrinsic activity, you go to the museum in Oslo, and you see this painting, and then you get some stimulus-induced activity, and this is the result of the rest-stimulus interaction. So maybe if this activity is very low, the stimulus might be able to elicit a lot of activity, and you have a strong impression. If this activity is already very high, the stimulus may not be able to elicit much activity, meaning you don't perceive the painting as strongly relevant to you. So your brain has a very strong say, and you know this very well. If you're in a shitty mood, the best coffee cannot improve your mood. If you're in a good mood, the coffee just tops it. So the same thing, the coffee, you perceive completely different. Yeah, same physical features, you perceive completely different. Remember, that's what I meant when you have to stand here, you perceive the audience completely different than you. So, meaning the brain has a strong say. So that means, again, as I said, the metaphor that sort of the brain intrinsic activity might provide a relational matrix, and what I call sort of a spatial temporal continuity, upon which every stimulus is integrated. And I would argue that maybe this integration process, if it's a spatial temporal, is across time, across space, may be closely linked to what Whitehead called prehension. And if you want to conceptually play around a little bit, you might say it's not really self-related processing, because that is still metaphorical, because you assume something which is not really there. This is a metaphor, this is an observer-based concept. You would say just brain-related processing, because that's what the brain does. It relates the stimuli from the outside. Its resting state activity relates the stimuli from the outside world to itself. So, and then of course the next question is, and this is a crucial question, that I would argue that maybe due to the prehension, due to this constitution of a temporal continuity, you have a first step in transforming a purely neuronal state into a phenomenal state. So that means you might want to put prehension as a necessary enabling condition of the possibility of consciousness. Yeah? So of course I would need to demonstrate that experimentally the different steps and conceptually. It's something I'm currently working on. What would be future experimental and conceptual steps? As I already said, we need to investigate self-relatedness across time, past-present interaction design, present-future interaction design, exactly what we're currently doing, and I think that would then conform also to what Whitehead called the conformation. Then, very important, we need to link the spatial continuity of the resting state, spatial temporal continuity, and we need to show this, and how that interacts with self-relatedness. Yeah? And again, here the psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, depression, are paradigmatic examples. One thing when reading Whitehead, I was not fully clear, and we might discuss this. He discusses a lot about the temporal dimension in the context of the prehension, but he never talks about the spatial dimension in the context of prehension, as far as I read. So, and I'm not fully clear, and I will come back to that in the two different perceptual modes. And I would really be interested in knowing your opinion to that, because prima vista, I would think the brain has to operate, has only two dimensions it can work with, spatial and temporal dimension. So I'd be surprised if there's a dissociation at this level between spatial and temporal dimension. But we may want to discuss this. And then, as I said already, that since ultimately what I'm interested in is subjectivity and consciousness, so how is it possible that a neuronal state is experienced as a mental state, as a phenomenal state, and then what we call mental state. Yeah? And so I would argue that the possibility of prehension might very much contribute to the transformation of a neuronal state into a phenomenal state. So I would speak of a neuronal phenomenal transformation. Whether that could provide a conceptual bridge between what Whitehead calls physical and conceptual prehension, I don't know. Leave it for the discussion. Yeah? But I found these two opposite poles quite interesting, which makes sense from his perspective. From an experimental brain perspective, you're puzzled. Yeah? From his perspective, it makes sense. But my perspective is now, I'm switching into the brain perspective, that, wow, what are the concepts doing? On the other hand, that the concept I reside makes also sense. So, as I said, everything is difficult with the brain. Okay, let's go to the probably a little bit easier things, or presumably easier things. Whitehead concept of emotion as subjective forms, and which I find very appealing. I like the concept of subjective form. I like the form. You can see our work with forms, organization. I'm very Kantian in that. And I like the subjective. Of course, one would need to define the concept of subjective here, but I think it's a very basic sense of subjectivity which aligns closely to what I mean by subjectivity. One could probably even say maybe it's maybe not as strong as the Kantian sense of subjectivity, but it goes into this direction. That's the way I understand Whitehead, but can be open for discussion. So now you can already infer, if Whitehead says emotions are the subjective form of basic processes, then of course, and I assume that self-related processing, is a basic process. Then of course you would assume that self-related processing and emotion processing are closely linked together. That's very easy. And go back to your own phenomenological experience. You always experience yourself in the context of a certain emotion. Always in a mood, you have a certain feeling, affect, emotion. You never have an affect-free self. If you have, you're severely depressed and you try everything to get your emotions back and your feelings. So how can we study this? So we investigated a paradigm where subjects saw emotions, here picture viewing, and then afterwards they had to judgment, and they had these emotional pictures and they had to evaluate them as either high self-related or low self-related. And we had the visual analog scale, and then we did the following. So with the different degrees of self-relatedness, we related them directly to the different degrees of neural activity during the emotion process. So this was a direct way of sort of, for the experts on new parametric plotting of the degree of self-relatedness on the neural activity during emotion. And surprisingly what you get, you see here, the blue, these are the signals which you get in fMRI, the bold signal for the expert. The blue curve is high self-relatedness, the green curve is medium self-relatedness, and the red one is low self-relatedness. And interestingly, you see that the degree of self-relatedness directly modulates, or parametrically, or linearly, as we would say, the degree of neural activity during emotion process. So, and these are, when you look for the experts on you, is the typical regions here. And this is the ventral striatum, this is the tectum, we see the amygdala. So these are typical emotion regions, and you see that these emotions are modulated by the degree of self-relatedness. And again, you see a lot of subcortical regions. So that really tells you these processes must be basic processes. They already go on in subcortical regions, and probably even in species which do not have such an elaborated cortex.
Your amygdala is actually first, right? And then it is actually secondarily, perhaps in the dorsal medial prefrontal. I see a little, about 8 seconds in the right.
Yeah, the timing is, be careful, because with fMRI, I would not bet on timing.
Is timing important?
Definitely, but with fMRI you cannot measure timing.
Too bad.
Yeah, that is so I'd be careful with that, because this is all model driven and so complicated. So, but it would be an interesting thing to do. The only thing to do this is with intracranial recording, which indeed we currently do in Toronto. Exactly. Because with EEG you don't get down there. Yeah. Okay. So then you might say, if it's parametrically modulated, so you see these regions activity, like they both are activated during self and emotions. I didn't show this, but you see then you might say, how is it possible? So they are closely aligned, there's a close overlap, but they are not identical. So how is it possible that we can distinguish? So then we looked at the direction of the parametric modulation of emotion dimensions, valence, positive, negative, arousal, and the degree of self-relatedness. You see the more activity, the higher degree of self-relatedness, the more activity, the lower the degree of emotional arousal. So that pertains to some distinction between the two. On the other hand, you have other regions like the amygdala and tectum, where it's modulated in the same direction. So we assume on the basis of these findings that sort of there's a neural dissociation between emotion and self, as well as a neural association, as we call it. So you see there's a close relationship between the two, but they're not identical. Yeah? And so that really pertains to the they're somehow linked, but they're not identical. I think that would make perfect sense when you now go with Whitehead, that you say maybe the objective process is the self-related processing, and the emotions are the subjective form of that. And since this is not identical, it might be an intricate linkage. But of course, that bridge from the empirical data to the conceptual description remains open for discussion. But what is clear is that self and emotion seem to be intrinsically linked to each other. And I think that would provide empirical support to Whitehead's assumption of the linkage of emotions as subjective forms. The other thing which, when you here look through my third point, when I say I speak, I know that's a very strong thesis, I shouldn't have written that, but when you're in the plane, you're up there in the air, you get a lot of speculative ideas. So I prepared this talk while flying this morning to California. So I speak of a phenomenal and neuronal necessity of emotions. What do I mean by that? Phenomenally, you cannot live without emotional feelings. It's always there. And your affective consciousness is probably a building block, essential core element of the possibility of consciousness as such. At least Panksepp would argue like this, and I think I would argue the same way. What you call qualia, phenomenal qualitative qualities. And when I speak of neural necessity, that they're always linked. So even in the resting state, you have a certain mood, you have emotions. When you're dreaming, when you're mind wandering, it's always, emotions are always there. In the background, even as a mood. They're always there. How that, the transition from the resting state into a mood state, I think this is an interesting thing to research in the future. So I think that would make perfect sense, and indeed, that emotions are the subjective form. And I can only say that intuitive, I like this characterization of the subjective form, but at the present, I think I'm not able to put some empirical, experimental meat to the bone, and also conceptually, I think I don't have a grip on that. So then, I should probably go to a special instance of emotions, religious emotions. So that leads me to the topic. And I think in order to understand that, I think we need to shed a light on what Whitehead describes as the mode of, oh, there's a mistake, mode of perception, perception in the mode of causal efficacy. So that leads me to my third specific aim. Whitehead's concept of perception in the mode of causal efficacy and the brain's stimulus-rest interaction. So far, you heard from me about resting state, self-related processing, and rest-stimulus interaction. How the resting state impacts the stimulus-induced activity, and then you feel a phenomenal sense of self. But now, I do it the other way. And I also characterize the resting state by temporal continuity, by spatial temporal matrix of continuity, of relational coding. And the question is, where does this come from? It doesn't come from heaven. That I must say as a neuroscientist and as a non-speculative philosopher. So now I look at the other side of things. I look how the stimuli impact the resting state activity. So now I reverse the picture. Now I don't look from the brain to the environment, but now I look from the environment to the brain. So, and the question is how that there is a certain psychological relevance of resting state activity. When you have mind wandering, it's always about personally relevant thoughts. It's been experimentally shown, and you know this by yourself. When you dream episodes which are personally relevant. Your self-relatedness and your emotions are always with you. And these are instances which occur purely in the resting state. So suddenly you wonder, how is it possible that this damn resting state, which is just pure neuronal activity, is psychologically relevant? So meaning, how does this psychological relevance come into the resting state? So we did an investigation where we indeed, this is the guiding question. So what we did here is, so we again presented stimuli, emotional stimuli, high self and low self stimuli. But then what we investigated is not the neural activity during these stimuli, but the neural activity in the resting state after the stimuli. So we investigated the resting state after high self stimuli and compared it with the resting state after low self stimuli. So we wanted to investigate the impact of self-relatedness on the subsequent resting state, stimulus, resting, interaction. So this is what you see. So this is, and again we did this parametric analysis, and what you see, so this is the part. You have to see that the state in both cases is the same, it's resting state. But whether the resting state followed a high self-stimuli or a low self-stimuli. So in what you see again, my beloved cortical midline structures. Yeah, these are exactly the same regions you saw before. And this is pure resting state or fixation cross when you just had to fixate a cross. And you see also the signal differences that high self leads to higher activity in the subsequent resting state than low self. Yeah? And you see also again sort of a parametric modulation. So that tells you that the resting state seems to be particularly sensitive to the degree of self-relatedness, of personal relevance. And of course we also checked for other dimensions like emotion, valence, positive, negative, or emotional arousal. The main effect was really here of the self. So that means that the resting state must have some particular features yet unknown, which are particularly sensitive to the degree of self-relatedness, meaning they code the degree of relatedness. Yeah? Like the computer codes 0 and 1. The brain seems to code, the resting state seems to code relatedness. Yeah? So in that, maybe by that, it may be impacted. So, so what does follow from that? That means that the resting state must contain specific properties, which we do not know yet, which are very sensitive to the degree of personal relevance, so relating the brain to its environment and being impacted by itself by that, and at the same time impacting any kind of incoming stimulus by that. And of course, I assume one central feature is the temporal, spatial temporal continuity. But the question, how is that generated? It must be a specific way of neural coding. It cannot be according to 0 and 1. It must be a relational coding. It must be somehow different moments across time and space must be somehow related to each other. And the better that relation matches with the resting state, the higher the degree of self-relatedness. So maybe self-relatedness turns out that sort of a matching between the stimuli feature, its spatial temporal feature, and the resting state, spatial temporal feature. But that's experimental. But what is clear, and this is interesting, this really has a lot of experimental and methodological implications, because suddenly in your experimental design, your resting state is the independent variable, and your stimulus-induced activity and your psychological function are the dependent variable. So you reverse all your experimental designs. May not be so important for you, but for the neuroscience, it's a complete reverse Yeah? So suddenly I don't take the perspective of the stimulus, but I take the perspective, as paradoxical as it sounds, of the brain. Yeah? That's the same way Kant also took the perspective of the mind and no longer of the sense impression. And that's why he was able to reveal the a priori contributions of the mind itself. So, question, how is that related, such stimulus-rest interaction related to Whitehead's concept of perception in the mode of causal efficacy? So first you might say, Dr. Northoff, everything very nice, but this is a severe category mistake. Your stimulus-rest interaction is a purely neuronal concept. Perception is a phenomenal concept. And remember, we had this problem of the neuronal phenomenal transformation, so the different contexts. So one thing I think one can definitely say, that if the brain undergoes stimulus-rest interaction, that it conforms and adapts to the environment. So I think it conforms to, as probably Whitehead would say, to realities in the environment, in the body. So I think this is a very strong point, and Whitehead always puts these, as I understand him, together as a confirmation to realities and the perception in the mode of causal efficacy. It's a central point, as I understand him. Yeah? So I think this is really a very nice thing, that the stimulus-rest interaction, what I describe on the neuronal level, might correspond well to what Whitehead describes on the phenomenal level. But this is a pure correspondence. The question is, I'm lacking the processes which provide the transition. And that they must be presupposed by the resting state itself. The second point is basically exactly that not only stimuli from the world, but also the body must conform to the resting state of the brain, or the resting state conforms to that, to those stimuli. The question is, to what kind of properties in these stimuli does the brain's resting state conform to? We don't know. Of course, I have certain ideas, but at this point, I don't want to speak about. So that's something we need to know, because that might give us some ideas about the features of the resting state. And that might also give us some ideas why there's a transformation of neuron into phenomenal states. So what I would argue that we would need to sort of provide the bridge, conceptual and empirical bridge, between what Whitehead described as perception of causal efficacy within the phenomenal context of perception, and what I describe as stimulus-rest interaction within the neuronal context. So this is exactly here, and this pertains, of course, to this question, mechanisms of such stimulus-rest interaction is unclear. And another point, this is sort of more speculative assumption which I put forward to the discussion. What I like very much how Whitehead distinguished between the perception in the mode of causal efficacy, which he described as vague, indefinite, and uncertain. So I summarize that in these three features. Whereas the perception in the mode of presentation immediacy, he described as definite, precise, and certain. So what I could imagine is that what I describe as rest-stimulus interaction may correspond on the phenomenal level to what Whitehead described as perception in the mode of presentation immediacy. Whereas, as I said, stimulus-rest interaction, perception in the mode of causal efficacy. So I think this is an interesting working hypothesis. But as I said, I put it open for discussion. The question is really, and that you might argue from the phenomenal point of view, the stimulus-rest interaction, how do you perceive that? It certainly impacts, let me see, I think I have this in the next slide. You certainly perceive that, but you don't perceive it directly. You perceive it indirectly via the subsequent rest-stimulus interaction. So, but of course, sometimes things may reverse, so I come back to that. So that means if there is such intense stimulus-rest interaction, that our brain is intrinsically tied to the environment, that you can speak of environment-brain linkage. And the environment in this context includes both the world as well as the body, because both are the environment from the perspective of the brain. So you have an intrinsic linkage, and that means that the brain is intrinsically relational. That's and then you have a close marriage. I discussed it here with regard to neuroscience and anthropology. So future experimental and conceptual steps, I think I already mentioned some of that. The features of the stimuli to which the brain's resting state is sensitive or shows affinity is unclear. The other point, how do we access stimulus-rest interaction in our consciousness? Because you remember the description by Whitehead as vague, indefinite, and uncertain. So is it really only indirect via rest-stimulus interaction, or is it a different form? And as I understand Whitehead, it would be a separate form of perception, which is a non-sense-based perception. So it would be an interesting thing how that relates. Definitely, the stimulus-rest interaction creates certain features which are a necessary predisposition for the possibility of subsequent consciousness. Yeah, so in that sense, I would probably speak of pre-phenomenon. But that's still not perception, because perception is phenomenon. So it would be an interesting case to investigate it, and I think it raises a lot of interesting questions, conceptual as well as experimental issues. And you see exactly here, this is what I see here. Prior to consciousness, Whitehead says it in one of his writings, and I would say it's predisposition, necessary condition, non-subject of consciousness. And the rest-stimulus interaction then yields phenomenal consciousness. But whether that is enough to speak of perception in the sense of Whitehead, I don't know. I leave that open to discussion.
Could you repeat your point about Freud?
Freud? I did not bring in Freud. I could, but I don't want to complicate it. I want to save you some hours in therapy. So, yeah, no, that would be too complicated. But indeed, I mean, this is the interesting thing. Freud had a similar model of neural form and organization on the psychological level. This is really interesting when you see this model. So I discussed this in my book on neuropsychoanalysis. Also, again, the structure, form, organization, both concepts. Yeah, it has its own input. Yeah, and Freud in turn relied very strongly on Kant. You can draw a lot of analogies. So I already mentioned here the vagueness, uncertainty, and the question is: do we have different encoding mechanisms for stimulus-rest interaction and rest-stimulus interaction? Because both differ in these three properties. So you might assume that there might be different encoding mechanisms which account for that. So maybe different features of the same stimuli, of the sense data. I mean, Whitehead says this, the location and the sense data are common to both modes of perception. But maybe the sense data, different features of the same data are encoded in both modes of perception, which then would account for these differences in these three features. But that's, of course, speculative assumption. Okay, I come to my towards the end of my talk. So how is stimulus-rest-based perception in the mode of causal efficacy related to religious experience? So you see already I make a strong claim. I would argue that religious experience has something to do with perception in the mode of causal efficacy and must be somehow based on stimulus-rest interaction, rather than a definite form of rest-stimulus interaction. Why? This is a pure intuitive, phenomenologically based argument, because religious experience is about the world, it's about the unity of yourself with the world. And where do you get access to the world in your neural activity during stimulus-rest interaction? So it seems to be that something which is usually not directly accessible in consciousness in a phenomenal context, stimulus-rest interaction, becomes suddenly accessible in religious experience directly. And I'm not sure whether I read Whitehead right. He speaks at some point that the reversion in the roles of the two perception modes. I'm not sure, in my terms, it would be sort of, forgive me the valued term, the confusion between rest stimulus and stimulus-rest interaction. So suddenly maybe the phenomenal consciousness associated usually with rest-stimulus interaction becomes transferred to the usually pre-phenomenal, only implicitly present in the phenomenal context, stimulus-rest interaction. But that's something I would. And then some of the properties which are usually related with the perception in the mode of presentation and immediacy become transferred to the perception in the mode of causal efficacy. But of course, as I said, needs to be open for discussion. But it's, and I'm talking here only about religious experience. I do not talk about present absence of God, existence of God. So, and it's clear that religious experience is very affective, and I already showed that in the resting state, the self-stimulus interaction is strongly associated with emotional subjective form, so it's clear that that also then becomes transferred onto religious experience, in particular very basic emotions, yeah? What Panksepp would call primary emotions. And that's exactly the point where Tandika comes in, and with Schleiermacher, and let me just briefly the last 3 slides. So that pertains, this is why I'm interested. So how is it possible that you have this basic affective experience in religious experience? Because it must tell me something about the mechanism of the brain. So the question, how can we approach it? And I hope that the methodology I practice here already gave you a slight hint of how I see a systematic methodology, neurophilosophical neurotheology. And when I read Whitehead, I really liked how he considers the relationship between philosophy and science. I really, really liked it. I'm not used to that from academic philosophy. And a lot of philosophers have discussed about what philosophy is about, but not many people really show what the methodology of philosophy. That's where your dogmatism comes in. We were talking about this. And of course, I'm a scientist. So a science is defined by a particular methodology. So if I want to make neurophilosophy a science in its own right, I need a specific methodology and a non-dogmatic methodology. So, and of course, and I think one can apply the same to religious experience. So, and we have a very transdisciplinary approach, and sort of what I like this quote from Whitehead, the true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation, it makes a flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, and it again lands for renewed observation, rendered acute by rational interpretation. But I think you can't describe it better than what I imagined. So you have to go, in my language, you have to go back and forth between philosophy and science. Because concepts always have certain empty positions. Vagueness is an intrinsic feature of concept. Even Quine said that you cannot translate one-to-one. That pertains to the vagueness of concept. And the facts are meaningless. The data, I should speak better of data than of fact, are meaningless without concepts. This is the way our brain sets up the reality for us. Why that is so, I don't know. But the implication for our method is clear. We need to constantly shift between concept and fact, and we might enrich the concept by that, and we give a better meaning to the data. So this is why I speak of concept-fact iterativity as a systematic transdisciplinary methodology. So this is the second to last slide, and I know it's very impressive with all the errors. I made some mistakes with my PowerPoint, but something will come. So we start, and this is our project on religious experience. We start with the cultural context. So this is the phenomenology of religious experience across different cultures. Because what primarily I am interested in, I'm not interested in, okay, religious experience activates this in this region, and in Islam it is this region, and in Christianity it is this region. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in whether there are certain commonalities across the different religions with regard to underlying neuronal mechanisms. So I want to look why our brain, maybe there's in our brain a certain process mechanism which predisposes us, remember, necessary condition of the possibility of So this is why I start very with the subjective experiential approach, phenomenology of religion, religious experience, religious practices in different cultural contexts. So we discussed this. Then the second is really the, as I said, I try to shed some light on this, the process-based account in with Whitehead studies, and as well as Schleiermacher. Plandeka is there the expert. I should shut up in that respect. Then the neuronal context, as I already said, the neuronal predisposition of the process-based account of religious experience. And I hope this can be read yet. And then sort of that we have sort of a shared or common vocabulary for religious experience, which integrates affective, process-based, cultural, and neuronal aspects. So this is sort of where we can explain that. And very important, and this is really the iterative component, that we feed back this vocabulary then with our empirical data, with the initial concepts, with the initial phenomena. And then we start the whole loop again. So you see we have work for the next 30 years. And last question, of course, for a philosopher, what do you expect, other than a what question? What is the brain and what is the self? I do not find the brain a gruesome device, but a fascinating device, where we don't really know yet what it does and what it contains. But what is clear, I think, that the brain continuously relates us to the environment, and it's really a relational organ, if you want to say so. The heart is a pumping organ. Your stomach is a digestive organ. For me, the brain is a relating or relational organ. It's intrinsically relational. Remember this environment, brain, stimulus, rest, interaction, then the rest, stimulus, interaction. So it's really intrinsically relation, and I think that relation is what we as outside observers or philosophers call. So, thank you very much.